Something is off in today's world, and most people can feel it, even if they can't explain it. The confusion between men and women, the rising tension in relationships, the endless debates over femininity and power. It didn't come out of nowhere. And strangely enough, Carl Jung warned us about this long before it became a cultural storm. He didn't mention TikTok, gender roles, or modern feminism. Jung spoke a different language, the language of the unconscious. He understood that when we fail to make peace with the deep forces inside us, those forces begin to rule us from the shadows. And nowhere is that more dangerous than in how we relate to the feminine. When people talk about what happened to women, the conversation often turns shallow. But Jung wasn't talking about surface-level behaviors. He was warning us about archetypes, powerful ancient patterns that live in every psyche. When they're ignored, distorted, or left in the dark, they don't disappear. They return in disguise, louder, more chaotic, and more destructive. In Jung's own words, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Today, many are calling it fate. They say society is collapsing, relationships are broken, and no one understands each other anymore. But beneath the noise, what if this is all just the result of something much deeper, something we didn't listen to? The modern confusion about women is not new. It's the echo of an old imbalance, one Jung tried to warn us about, and now we're living in the consequences. Let's go back, not to the past, but to the psyche, to the very place where this all began. To understand what's unfolding in our culture today, we have to start with the anima, the inner feminine energy that, according to Carl Jung, exists in every man. This isn't some vague spiritual idea. The anima is real in psychological terms. It's the emotional, intuitive, feeling-oriented side of the masculine psyche. When a man doesn't confront or integrate his anima, he begins projecting it onto the women around him. That projection becomes dangerous, not for her, but for him. Think about this. How often do we see men fall in love with the idea of a woman instead of who she really is? How often do relationships start with fantasy, only to collapse under the weight of unmet, unrealistic expectations? That's projection. That's the anima, unrecognized, operating in the dark. Jung warned us that if a man fails to make peace with his inner feminine, he will seek her outside himself, chasing illusions, becoming obsessed, even resentful when reality doesn't match the dream. This explains why some men worship women to the point of losing themselves, and others blame women for everything that goes wrong in their lives. Two extremes, same root problem: disconnection from the anima. And it doesn't stop there. In a culture that denies men emotional education, that mocks vulnerability and encourages detachment, the anima has nowhere to go. So she becomes distorted. She leaks out in unhealthy ways, through obsession, avoidance, addiction, or rage, masked as logic. Now ask yourself, how many of today's gender wars, online debates, and cultural tensions are actually just the collective pain of men wrestling with their anima and not even knowing it? We weren't taught this. No one explained that inner harmony isn't just a nice idea, it's the foundation of everything. And when that balance is lost, relationships suffer, communication collapses, desire turns into control, respect turns into fear. So what happens when this inner imbalance plays out, not just in one man, but across an entire generation? That's where we go next. When an entire generation grows up without understanding the inner world, without learning how to navigate emotional depth, symbolic meaning, or psychological balance, archetypes don't disappear. They mutate. This brings us to one of Jung's more unsettling insights: the devouring mother. Now, before you react to the name, understand that Jung wasn't speaking about actual mothers. He was describing a psychological force. The devouring mother represents a form of feminine energy that becomes overprotective, controlling, or emotionally manipulative. It appears when the nurturing instinct turns possessive, when care becomes control. And this archetype doesn't just show up in family dynamics. In modern culture, it can take the form of ideologies that infantilize people instead of empowering them. Emotional safety becomes the excuse to suppress truth. Dependency is encouraged over growth. Boundaries dissolve in the name of love, but at the cost of autonomy. Sound familiar? Look at how some aspects of modern discourse elevate emotional comfort over honest dialogue, or how hyper-nurturing turns into overreach, controlling partners, micromanaging relationships, and calling it protection. Jung would say, this isn't just a personal issue, it's archetypal. It's what happens when the feminine is wounded and the masculine is absent. Because when the devouring mother takes center stage in a society, something else fades quietly into the background, the structure, direction, and grounded presence of the healthy masculine. So here's the deeper question. What happens when a culture is flooded with unchecked emotionalism but starved of clarity, strength, and accountability? That's where we're headed next. When the devouring mother rises, she doesn't just dominate the outer world, she suppresses something within us all, the healthy masculine. This is the part of the psyche that gives direction, clarity, boundaries, and purpose. Jung called it the logos, the ordering principle, the force that says, here is who I am and here is where I stand. Without it, we drift. We doubt, and eventually we disappear into confusion. So here's what we're really talking about. A generation of men disconnected from their own masculine essence. And not by accident. Many were raised in environments where fathers were emotionally or physically absent, where masculinity was criticized, or where no strong model of disciplined, integrated manhood was ever present. What replaces it? Two things. Either passive appeasement or reactive aggression. Men either try to please at all costs, hoping to be accepted by an ever-shifting definition of what's right, or they overcorrect into resentment and hostility. Neither leads to fulfillment. Neither creates real connection, and neither reflects the depth Jung believed the masculine was capable of. Now pause and think. How many men today are unsure of their role? Unsure of their voice, walking on eggshells, not because they're weak, but because the framework that used to shape masculine identity has collapsed? And let's be clear, this isn't just a crisis for men. When the masculine disappears, so does the sacred tension between polarities. The dance between the masculine and the feminine becomes disoriented. The mystery turns mechanical, and relationships become power struggles instead of unions of complementary strength. Carl Jung didn't teach that masculinity should dominate. He taught that it must integrate, that it should stand alongside the feminine, not above or below it. But if it vanishes, something else will fill its place. What takes its place in today's world is far more dangerous than most realize. So what fills the void when the masculine fades and the feminine becomes distorted? Archetypes don't just disappear, they evolve, or more dangerously, they become idols. That's what Carl Jung warned us about. When we lose connection to the symbolic meaning behind these inner forces, we start to worship their outer forms blindly. This is where things get unsettling. Instead of understanding the feminine as a profound psychological force, nurturing, intuitive, life-giving, we reduce it to an image, a performance, a product. The ideal woman becomes a brand, not a being. You've seen it. Endless filters, perfected bodies, curated personalities, digital avatars of femininity that have more influence than real human connection. We don't engage with women, we engage with projections. Projections that were once rooted in something sacred, now twisted into marketing, mimicry, and mimicry of mimicry. And men fall into the trap too, not because they're shallow, but because they've never been taught how to see the feminine archetype consciously. So they chase illusions, or worse, they resent real women for not living up to the fantasy. This is what Jung meant when he said, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. When we forget that these archetypes live within us, we start believing they exist only out there, in others, in culture, in the unattainable. And once we do that, the feminine isn't something we relate to with reverence. It becomes something we consume. And when we consume what should be sacred, we hollow it out. Now ask yourself, what kind of relationships are we building when both men and women are trapped in roles they didn't choose, but feel pressured to perform? And if we've turned the feminine into a fantasy and the masculine into a threat, what kind of future are we really building? There's one more layer we haven't addressed yet, and it's the most dangerous of all. When archetypes turn into idols, the next thing to fall is balance. And when balance collapses, mystery disappears. Jung believed that human wholeness depends on the tension of opposites, masculine and feminine, light and shadow, order and chaos. These polarities aren't enemies. They're dance partners. Each one helps define the other, and through their interaction, we evolve. But what happens when that dance stops? In today's world, polarity isn't just misunderstood, it's actively dismantled. The sacred distinction between masculine and feminine isn't honored, it's flattened, blurred, or politicized. Not to create unity, but to avoid discomfort. To erase the discomfort of not understanding something instead of exploring it. This creates a crisis, not just of gender, but of meaning. When everything is interchangeable, nothing feels sacred. When roles are undefined, relationships lose clarity. When attraction is reduced to utility or power, the deeper magnetic force between the masculine and feminine dissolves. Ask yourself, when was the last time you saw a relationship built on mutual reverence rather than competition or performance? We don't just lose connection with others, we lose the mystery that once made love, desire, and union feel transcendent. Jung would say that's not just a cultural loss, it's a spiritual wound. And maybe that's why so many people today feel numb. Not because they're broken, but because they've been cut off from the very forces that give life its depth. So here's the uncomfortable truth. If we can't honor the mystery between masculine and feminine, if we can't even recognize the roles these forces play in our inner world, then we'll continue to project, blame, and break without ever understanding why. And that brings us to the question we've been circling since the beginning. What did Carl Jung actually mean when he warned us? What was the real message that got lost in translation? Let's answer that once and for all. Carl Jung didn't warn us about women themselves. That's the first thing we have to make clear. He warned us about what happens when we misunderstand the feminine and what happens when we project our unhealed psyche onto it. Jung saw the feminine not as a gendered concept, but as a profound psychological force. It shows up in women, yes, but also in men, in dreams, in symbols, in cultures. It's the force of feeling, intuition, chaos, creation, beauty, nature, and it demands to be understood, not exploited. When we fail to understand it, two things happen. We either idealize it and become blindly infatuated, or we fear it and try to control, silence, or mock it. Neither reaction is about women as people. It's about the collective shadow being projected outward. And when Jung spoke about the dangers of an unconscious society, this is what he meant, that without awareness, we turn others into mirrors of our unresolved selves. So when he saw men chasing fantasy or blaming the feminine for their powerlessness, he wasn't criticizing women, he was pointing to a society that had lost its center. He was saying, if we don't face our own internal feminine, our own anima, we'll distort everything around us trying to compensate. We'll collapse under the weight of our projections. And we see this happening today, on both sides. In relationships that aren't rooted in truth, in resentment disguised as empowerment, in shallow attraction followed by deep disillusionment. Because the truth is, the feminine is not here to comfort us or please us. She's here to transform us, to draw us into the unknown, to challenge our ego, to demand depth. And if we don't honor that role, we reduce her to a stereotype, a fantasy, a scapegoat. So the real warning wasn't about women, it was about what happens to men and to society when the feminine is misused, misunderstood, or made unconscious. But here's the good news. The solution was always within reach, and Jung gave us the first step. Jung's solution was never about blame. It was about integration. He believed that true transformation doesn't come from changing others. It comes from facing ourselves, from bringing the unconscious into the light, from recognizing the parts of us we've denied, disowned, or projected onto the people closest to us. And when it comes to the feminine, that means one thing: we must stop looking out there for what can only be healed in here. Jung taught that every man carries the anima within him. She's not a fantasy. She's not someone to chase. She's a mirror of his own emotional truth, his own capacity to feel, to imagine, to receive, to create. The same goes for women. They carry the animus, the inner masculine, the drive to protect, to discern, to speak with strength and move with direction. When either side is rejected or inflated, imbalance follows. But when both are integrated, something powerful happens: wholeness. That's what we've lost in today's world. Not men, not women, but the bridge between them. And Jung believed that this bridge begins inside the individual, not in society at large. So the real message was never about modern women. It was about modern people, wandering in the dark, blaming the mirror for the reflection they haven't yet understood. Ask yourself this: what part of the feminine have you rejected in yourself? What part have you chased in others instead of developing within? What if the chaos we see today is just the unconscious crying out to be seen, finally, without distortion? Because in the end, Jung wasn't trying to warn us about women, he was trying to wake us up. And now, that choice, to ignore the message or finally listen, is yours.